Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. The occupation of Japan after World War II is often considered a masterclass in civil affairs. It was not perfect, but it was successful. General Douglas MacArthur's primary mission was to demilitarize Japan. Before he even arrived in Japan, however, he was convinced that a sustainable peace would require significant legal and social changes, particularly in terms of the status of Japanese women. We have discussed MacArthur's role in mandating and supporting these reforms related to women in a previous podcast, but we have never focused on any of the staff members in his headquarters who actually drafted some of these new policies. One of those staff members was a young woman named Beate Sirota. Today, we will discuss her contributions during the occupation, and we are joined by her daughter, Professor Nicole Gordon. Welcome, Professor, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give us a biographical sketch of your mother leading up to World War II? Tell us about her family, how they came to live in Japan, and what life was like for them there.
So my grandfather was a concert pianist. He was born near Kiev and moved to Vienna, where he studied under Busoni and concertized throughout Europe. It was very successful. My grandmother came, unlike my grandfather, from a very wealthy family in Russia, and they left after the pogroms, and they lived in Europe. My grandparents met in Vienna. My mother was born there, and when she was 5 years old, her family moved to Japan in 1928, which is pretty unusual for Westerners at that time. My grandfather got a position at the Imperial Academy of Music to run the Western music piano section, and that's where they lived. They lived a very comfortable life there. My grandfather was well known, was very much appreciated. My mother went to the German school as a child, and then after that became too Nazified, she moved to the American school in Japan for her last year. And she was very young when she finished. And about that time, she went to the States to go to college. She was supposed to go to the Sorbonne in France, but by that time, the war had progressed too far for that. And so, although she had plans to share a room with a cousin of hers, that didn't work out. And my grandparents sent her to Mills College in California, which to their mind was, on the one hand, the closest spot they could find to Japan, and on the other hand, in America, which to them was cowboys and Indians. It was very strange. So she was not quite 16 when they dropped her off at Mills. Not so long afterwards, Pearl Harbor was attacked. My grandparents, in fact, were on the last civilian boat from Pearl Harbor to Yokohama before the attack. And I have a poster, actually, of a concert he gave there while they were waiting for the boat to leave. And my mother was suddenly left alone at a very young age, just a teenager, and no source of income, no family, not too many friends, I don't think, among grown-ups anyway, and in a foreign country. U.S. was a foreign country for her. So suddenly she had to figure out how to support herself and go to college. And luckily for her, the woman who was the dean at the time, Aurelia Reinhardt was her name, she was a very convinced feminist, and she was very supportive of my mother, and she allowed my mother to take her courses by exam so that she could work full time. And she worked at a number of different places, but I think the most interesting one was with the Office of War Information, where she did interpretation for radio broadcasts, primarily Japanese, but she knew half a dozen languages, so she could do all of that. And at one point, they asked her to do the Portuguese ones when she didn't know Portuguese. She did know Spanish. And so they said, well, you try. And she muddled along and did pretty well, because apparently she found a submarine not too far off the coast of California, and they were able to diffuse whatever was going to happen there. So it was a lonely time for her, but she did very well for herself under the circumstances. She finished all her courses. And after the war, of course, she wanted to find her parents because she didn't know if they were alive or dead. It wasn't the internet age. It was an age when you were really cut off from another country if there was a war going on, as she was, and not knowing what their circumstances were, whether they were alive or dead. She was trying to find a way to get to Japan. And it turned out the only way to do that was to be what they called a civilian attached to the army, because the civilians in general were not permitted in Japan during the occupation. So she was able to get a position because her Japanese was fluent, which was very rare in those days. There were only 60 some odd Caucasians in the United States who were fluent in Japanese at that time, and the army was not going to take Nisei, the first generation Americans, or second generation. And so she did get this job, and she was assigned to MacArthur's staff, the interpreters section, which incidentally is where she met my father. He was the chief of that department. He was a Bronx boy who had learned Japanese and Chinese, and that's his own story. So anyway, she got to Japan, and she went to the address where she had lived, the family house, and the entire place was bombed. There was nothing left. And she searched around trying to find my grandparents, not seeing any success at it. And she was, the story I understood was that she was sitting in a hotel lobby and started to cry. And the young man behind the desk saw her crying and went over to her and said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Well, I'm looking for my parents and I can't find them and I don't know what's happened to them." And this young man said, "Well, what's their name?" And she said, "Well, my father's Leo Sirota." And this young man said, "Oh, I just heard him on the radio last night." So she got the first sign that they were alive because he had been on the radio. And so she was able to find him. He actually had left Tokyo to go to, they missed each other because she started to go to Karizawa, which was a summer resort where my grandparents had been interned. And he turned around and came back when he got the message. So they sort of missed each other on the train. But bottom line was she did find her parents. They were suffering from malnutrition. They had had a hard time during the war. Even though my grandfather was very well known, the Westerners were, despite that, they were sent to this country village, which was a summer resort and not well equipped for winter. So they had a very hard time, very lacking in food. There was no fuel. And the secret police would visit them every day to interrogate them on the same things that they had interrogated them on the days before and the weeks before, which were questions like, do you have a radio? They wanted to know if they were spies or they were getting information from the West. I don't know what. So it was a very bitter time for my grandparents. And after the war, when my grandfather was offered a position to stay in Japan and to continue teaching there and everything, he refused. He wouldn't stay. He was very bitter about how he had been treated during the war.
They're Jewish, and we know from our studies of the Philippines in the war that the Japanese were more concerned in the Philippines, at least, with what your passport said, not if you were Jewish or not. Was that not the same experience in Japan?
My mother would say that the Japanese were confused about the, quote, Jewish question, because although the Germans were very busy with that and trying to get the Japanese on board, the Japanese couldn't tell the difference between one Westerner and another. And they didn't, quote, get it. It wasn't that they were being recalcitrant necessarily, but they just didn't understand it. And I don't think that played a major part. I will say my grandparents came to Japan with an Austrian passport, and my mother had one too. And after the Anschluss, the Germans took away the Austrian passports and gave my grandparents and my mother German passports, in which was stamped J and changed name and all of that. So I don't think that their time in the internment camp was more about being Westerners, I think, than anything to do with being Jewish.
She just has this incredible story. I mean, just the fact of what she was able to do for herself at Mills College, how she gets to Japan, she finds her parents. What is her initial role then in MacArthur's headquarters?
She was strictly speaking an interpreter and a translator. I think she must have been doing mostly oral work because her reading of Japanese was not that great. She had never gone to Japanese school, but I know she was required to look at political articles in the paper and to translate them because they were in a period, the Army was in a period of the equivalent of denazification, going through the people who they felt, needed to be, I don't know whether they were incarcerated or removed or just taken off the air or taken out of the newspapers. I don't know what they did to people, but they were identifying the political parties that were in operation at the time. And so it was largely, I think, translation of potentially political materials.
And then eventually she is involved in drafting parts of the Japanese Constitution. What parts is she involved with?
Well, she was involved with the civil rights and in particular women's rights and also academic freedom. It was a very strange situation because when MacArthur decided that the Japanese were not doing a sufficient job in drafting a new constitution for themselves, he decided that the Americans would draft it. And it wasn't that they didn't get a bunch of constitutional scholars together. They just took everybody at general headquarters and said, you have 10 days to write a constitution, and they divided the people there into groups for different topics. My mother was put in the civil rights group, and the story was that she held her hand up. She was 21 years old, 22 years old, and said, "Can I have academic freedom too?" And they were just giving it out. And because she was on the civil rights group, the people in that group said to her, "Well, you are a girl, you write the women's rights section." That's how much they cared or thought about it. And of course, she took it extremely seriously. And it's sort of interesting. So many things worked in that in a positive way about that. One was going to Mills College, a women's college, and having seen the leadership of the dean there. But also, the European period when she was young was liberating for women to a certain degree. My grandmother was a very, very strong personality, and she had a lot of influences that were upholding her desires to do right by women. And one of those things was that she had been allowed, unlike a lot of other Western children, to play with Japanese children growing up. And so she visited their homes and she saw how the women were treated, how the husbands would be given their dinner in a very particular special way. And then after that, the women would eat alone. And, she knew about how women did not have rights of divorce, didn't have rights to property, and didn't have rights to custody of their children. So she had a very clear picture. And also, the traditional walking behind the husband, 6 steps behind. And so she had felt she had a very, very deep understanding of what it was like for Japanese women. And so she was really intent on doing right by them, right by them in the sense of doing what they would want, what they did want. And one of the things she did to start her work was to travel all around Tokyo and go to all the libraries that were still standing and get copies of constitutions from all over the world, not just the American Constitution, but the Weimar Constitution, the Scandinavian ones, the Russian one. And, among the people she was working with at General Headquarters, there were other people who knew other languages and knew other cultures too, of course. And everybody wanted her copies of the constitutions because whatever topic they were covering, they wanted resources to draw from in order to do the best possible job. So initially, she wrote a very, very detailed list of rights for women, including, education, nursing children, all kinds of very specific things. And interesting, it was the Americans who crossed out a lot of it. Colonel Cadies, who was in charge of this project and was my mother, respected him deeply, and so did my father. But he said, well, this is not what a constitution looks like. Because his model in his head was the American Constitution, which says sort of more generalized things, and then Congress fills in the gap, let's say. But a lot of other constitutions in other countries are not like that. And she argued with them very tenaciously. She said, in Japan, these are such very deep, historic, traditional ways that women are treated. They will never pass a civil code if you leave the general proposition as a vague aspirational point. So she argued very vehemently in favor of that. She lost a lot of what she wanted, but she did come away with some very important key items like rights to inheritance, custody rights, divorce rights to marry whom you wanted to, and a generalized statement about how quality of the sexes was to be respected. And what happened after that, which was really very fortuitous also, in the room where the Constitution was being negotiated with the Japanese, both my parents, they weren't married at the time, both my parents were in the room as interpreters. My mother's capacity to interpret very quickly, because she had so much experience with it, was very well appreciated, not just by the Americans, but by the Japanese as well. So she often translated on behalf of the Japanese, even though that wasn't really her job, but they were satisfied with it. And I guess their own interpreters were listening and making sure that they understood what was going on. And so this group was stuck in a room, and it was one of those, they were told, you're staying in this room until you come out with a document. And my mother said that the two most contentious discussions were about the de-deification of the emperor. In other words, that the Constitution was going to say that the emperor was not a god, was not going to treat the emperor as a god, which is how he was treated before, and the women's rights section. Interesting, the peace clause, the very famous peace clause in the Japanese Constitution, which is now a subject of some discussion, forbids the Japanese government from having an aggressive army. They're allowed to have a defensive army, but not an aggressive one. And that was not contentious. The Japanese were exhausted from the war, and they didn't want to have anything to do with military anything. So I was just, told. Anyway, they came to the women's rights clause at 2 a.m. or something, and the Japanese were very against it. It's against our traditions. It's this and that and the other thing. And Colonel Cadiz said to them, Beate Sirota has been so helpful to you in these discussions, and she has her heart set on these provisions, and let's just pass them. And they passed them. Now that's a shorthand description. I understand that it may not have been quite as fast as that. I think the principle behind it is correct. The Japanese that had not known that she had drafted those sections, I think they may have been told that, but it was a huge win for women, and it was definitely something that, from where my mother sat, was entirely an effort to bring the desires of Japanese women to the table. It was not an outside force that was, trying to change things against their will. It was all about expressing the will that they had not had a chance to express in most ways.
That's really interesting, too. And I'm just amazed that she had the presence of mind at a very, very young age, early 20s, to understand that and to draft this language. One of the things I know that we've seen in our research is that she obviously believes from her own experience that the Japanese women want this. MacArthur, for some reason, that we're not quite sure how to make that connection, he feels the same way personally. But then you have Washington, the State Department, universities across the United States telling him and his headquarters, Japanese women don't want this. So is it just her experiences in those Japanese homes and her ability to maybe communicate with Japanese women in day-to-day life that gives her that sense that they do want this? This is not just us imposing this.
Right. Definitely, it was about her personal experience, seeing what went on, and seeing the grief that it caused. I mean, it's not just, I heard somebody talking or something like that. It was, really being integrated into those rooms, which was, as I say, not usual for Westerners. It does stand to reason. I don't know who wants to, step 6 feet behind somebody, or not have rights to inheritance, or not have rights to divorce, or what have you. So that I don't know anything much about the history or what you're describing from the State Department, places like that. But I doubt that was a discussion that was being had with Japanese women. or with people who knew Japan intimately, who were not anything but, let's say, white men. It is interesting because I know during some of the discussions, Colonel Katie said to my mother, but in the US, we don't have these rights for women in the Constitution. And she said, yes, that's right. We don't have any mention of women in the Constitution. So in a way, it was a step forward beyond where the United States had gone. So I'm sure that was irksome to people, but it was right for the moment in Japan. Yeah.
MacArthur Memorial Archivist Jim Zobel conducted an oral history with your mother in 1999, and she was asked if she was intimidated about being one of the first women in MacArthur's headquarters, or if she was intimidated by any of the very famous people that were moving in and out of the headquarters. In that interview, I thought it was interesting. She made it very clear that her language skills and her knowledge of Japan were too important for anyone to worry about her being a woman. And she also said, I was not intimidated, I was respectful when meeting, I guess, a lot of these VIPs. Did she have any anecdotes about the headquarters staff or General MacArthur, anything like that during the occupation?
The story I most remember was just about how MacArthur had his own elevator in the Daiichi building, which was the headquarters, the GHQ. And whenever the elevator apparently was moving or there were sounds that made it sound as though he was coming, everybody would hide behind the pillars, big pillars in the lobby, not to be seen. That he was considered quite a difficult person and nobody really wanted to cross him or be near him. So that's the main story I've heard. I'm very interested in the description you just gave because it's very much in line with, I think, the European way in which she was brought up. I said before that, around then was also a time of quasi-liberation for European women, and she would have been very sensitive to that. But the part where she says, I was always respectful, that's also a very ingrained value that she was brought up with. And she was used to being with a lot of famous people, not people in the military or politicians, but ambassadors and famous musicians who were in their house all the time. Because anybody who came to Japan, would have been at that time, a person who was cultured and knowledgeable and world sophisticated. So she met a lot of very important people, and she knew the politenesses and the proper way to speak. But she also had this inner core of doing the right thing in the right way.
In 1946, she's accused of being a communist by the G2 in MacArthur's headquarters, Major General Charles Willoughby. Tell us about this.
That's a very disturbing story. I'm quite sure my mother didn't know about this until decades later, because I think I remember when she found out about it, and it was in some scholarly work that had gotten whoever had written it had gotten into the files of, with a Freedom of Information Act request or something. And she was very angry and very disappointed. I think that's General Whitney who said, yes, Willoughby. I think he was known for seeing red under any tree or under a bed, and she certainly was astounded and angry to be accused of that. But as I say, it was only many years later that she found out about it. There was definitely a time, and I don't know how much this came to Japan or when, but this was a very complicated time vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, because on the one hand, we had been their allies just coming out of the war. And then on the other hand, there was this beginning of the anti-communist and the communist and Western world break. So it's not a surprise that there was, sort of what you might call internal spying going on, or commenting, or wondering or worrying or making up stories, whatever it was about those things. But that was way away from my mother, and she was really, it was devastating to know that this had been on a record someplace.
Most scholars view the occupation as successful. How did she view its legacy and her own contributions?
She would have said it was absolutely successful. And of course, her her two biggest issues that she thought were, one was the women's rights, to be sure. The other was the peace clause. And she felt they were both extremely important. And she used to quote a Japanese suffragist, Ichikawa Fusai, who used to say, without women's rights, there is no peace, and without peace, there are no women's rights. So she had a very strong feeling that those were very intimately related. One thing that happened is still the case, actually. There's never been an amendment to the Japanese Constitution. And one of the reasons for that is that the women's rights groups have always opposed any amendment to the Constitution, even if it doesn't have to do with women's rights, because they fear that women's rights would be the next thing to go. And that's a genuine fear in Japan to this day. So, yes, she thought it was very successful. I think in general, and I'm not an expert on this, but I have a sense that in the world of constitutions or occupations, I think the scholars have pretty much been positive about the Japanese one. And I don't know all the reasons, but they were really devastated. They had nothing left by the time that time came about. And I think it was I guess it's not like the places you hear about, it's a colonial thing and people are being beaten down by the oppressors and that kind of thing. I think this is a more, maybe you'd call it a modern thing, that new ways of thinking were surely being brought in, and the change in the emperor, that was a huge business too. But, what we've seen over time is a very successful country, economically and in all kinds of ways.
Any final thoughts?
Well, the main thing, I guess, is just the issue of time passing and how these problems don't go away. And, you really have to keep the pressure on. This is no longer an issue that I don't suppose the Japanese or the Americans would think they had any engagement much with the rights of Japanese women, for example. But it's something that I know Japanese women, and I've been there a couple of times now and talked to a lot of them. They feel very strongly about it, and they feel they have to keep fighting for their rights, even though they have them. They feel they have to protect them. Put it that way, they have to protect them, and they would like broader rights, of course. And so I think my mother was very, very well aware of the precariousness of a lot of these, changes, but she was devoted to them. And she went to Japan several times a year when she was older, giving some enthusiasm and support to the women there. And I think that's the thing, that you have to keep up the good fight. I think other evidence of my mother's being a truth teller and not trying to impose unwanted restrictions or opportunities for women in Japan is the testimony that she gave many decades later in Congress in the United States. There was a discussion going on about the United States composing constitutions for Iraq and Afghanistan. And my mother was asked to testify about women's rights in those countries and what should be put in the Constitution. And she told the Congress people, I can tell you about my own experience in Japan, but I can't help you to discuss what should happen in those countries. I don't know those countries, and I wouldn't dare to suggest what I think the women there would think. My advice to you is to speak with women from Japan who experienced the change due to the constitution that was written after the war there, to give their experience about what life was like for them before the war and after the war, before the Constitution was changed to support women's rights and after. And to have those women be engaged with women in Iraq and Afghanistan about their experiences. And that would be a way for the United States to learn what would be in their best interests. And I just think that is an illustration that she was not of a mind that she wanted to impose things on people. She was there trying to express as best she knew how the real desires of the Japanese women.
Professor Gordon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.